The station had no windows on its lower levels. That was the first thing Juno noticed when he arrived. Every other species had been given quarters with a view of the stars. The human delegation had been placed in a block of rooms that faced an interior wall of gray metal. Nobody explained why. Nobody thought it needed explaining. Juno set his bag down on the narrow bed, looked at the wall for a moment, and then went to unpack. He had been in worse places. He had slept in field tents on 3 different planets during survey missions, eaten cold ration packs for weeks at a time, and once spent 11 days in a broken shuttle waiting for rescue. A gray wall was nothing. He was not a man who needed a view to feel steady. His aide, Jisoo, knocked on his door 20 minutes later. She was 26 years old and had graduated top of her class at the Earth Diplomatic Institute. She had dark eyes that moved quickly, like she was always reading something that wasn't there. She was good at her job. She was also, Juno had noticed, still under the impression that this posting was an honor. "The session starts in 2 hours, she said. I reviewed the seating arrangement. We're in the outer ring. Juno nodded. The outer ring was where observer species sat. Not at the main table, not even close to it. They would have a small raised platform off to the side, with a translation feed and a narrow desk and 2 chairs. They would be visible enough to show that humanity had been invited, but far enough away to make clear that the invitation had limits. Good, Juno said. Let's go early. The council chamber was enormous. It had been built 400 years ago by the Velhari, the oldest of the 17-member species, and it showed their preferences in every line of its design. High ceilings, deep shadows, seats arranged so that the Velhari delegation sat at the center of everything, raised slightly above the rest. Juno had studied the architecture before he came. He believed that the way a room was built told you everything about who built it and what they thought of everyone else. The other delegations arrived slowly. Most of them ignored the human platform entirely. A few glanced over with the kind of look that people give to furniture, a brief, blank acknowledgement that something exists, followed by immediate forgetting. One junior aide from the Veleni delegation stared openly for a moment, then was pulled away by an older colleague who whispered something sharp in his ear. Counselor Vreth arrived last. He was tall even by Velhari standards, with long pale fingers and a way of moving that made it clear he had never once hurried for anything or anyone. He looked at the human platform as he passed it. He smiled in the way that some people smile, not with warmth, but with the satisfaction of seeing something small and harmless placed exactly where it belonged. Juno looked back at him with a calm, steady expression and said nothing. The session opened with procedural announcements. Juno listened carefully. Jisoo took notes beside him, her pen moving fast. The first 3 items on the agenda were routine, trade route adjustments, a border clarification between 2 species whose names translated awkwardly into any human language, a memorial statement for a recently deceased Borati elder. Juno paid attention to all of it. He believed that the routine items were often where the real decisions were hidden, buried under careful language and administrative habit. Then came the 4th item, a newly charted star system, catalogued under the designation V7 Outer Reach, had been found to contain significant deposits of Vithium ore. Vithium was rare. It was used in the construction of faster-than-light drive components, in medical scanning technology, in the energy cores of large orbital stations. It was, in short, worth an enormous amount to whoever controlled it. The survey team that had mapped V7 Outer Reach had spent 14 months in deep space doing the work. They had run the geological scans, cataloged the asteroid fields, charted the radiation patterns, filed every report required under Council interstellar law. That survey team had been human. The data they produced had been shared freely with the Council, as required of all observer species. The vote that followed took less than 4 minutes. The V7 Outer Reach system was to be divided among the 5 oldest member species, effective immediately. Resource extraction rights, station placement rights, navigational authority over the approach corridors, all of it distributed among 5 civilizations that had done none of the surveying, filed none of the scans, and sent no one into that cold and distant space for 14 months. Humanity was not mentioned once. Juno raised his hand. He kept it raised, steady and patient, until a council clerk finally looked over and gave him a short, irritated nod, the signal that he could speak. "I would like to formally note," Juno said, "that the survey data on which this vote was based was produced entirely by a human science team operating under contract with this body. I would like to ask whether there is a process by which observer species may submit a formal contribution claim." There was a brief silence. Then Counselor Vreth leaned toward his microphone. His voice was smooth and easy, the voice of a person explaining something obvious to someone they had long since stopped expecting much from. "Observer species," he said, "do not hold formal claims under Council Charter. Your team's work was submitted as auxiliary data. It has been received as such. The vote stands." He sat back. The session moved on. Beside Juno, Jisoo had stopped writing. Her pen was still. She was staring at the main table with an expression that Juno recognized. Not anger exactly, but the specific, sharp feeling of watching something unfair happen in front of you and being told with great politeness that your eyes were wrong. Juno placed his hand briefly over hers. Then he opened his log and wrote one word. He did not say it out loud. He did not need to. The word was not for the council. It was for himself. A small, private marker, the kind a careful man places at the beginning of a very long road. The word was noted. The session continued. The humans sat in the outer ring, in the seats that had been chosen for them, beneath the ceiling that had been built by someone else, in a room that had been designed to make certain things clear without ever saying them directly. Juno listened to every word. He watched every face. He missed nothing. He was very good at waiting. 6 years passed. The council did not change. It grew larger in some ways. 2 new species had been admitted as observers, seated in outer rings of their own, but its habits stayed exactly the same. The people at the center of the table remained at the center. The people on the edges remained on the edges. The distance between the two did not shrink, not by a single step. Humanity's full membership vote had been scheduled 3 times. The first time, it was delayed because of a procedural conflict with a border negotiation that had nothing to do with humans. The second time, a Velhari counselor submitted a request for an extended review period, citing the need for further assessment of observer species readiness. The third time, the vote was simply removed from the agenda without explanation, replaced by a discussion about cargo tariffs on the outer shipping lanes. Juno had filed a formal inquiry after each delay. He had received polite written responses each time. The responses said very little in a great many words. He had kept every one of them. Filed, dated, organized. Jisoo was 32 now. The wide-eyed quality she had carried into the station on her first day was gone. In its place was something sharper and quieter, a kind of permanent alertness, like a person who had learned to watch for the moment before something went wrong rather than the moment after. She was better at her job than anyone Juno had worked with. She had also, sometime in the last 2 years, stopped being surprised by anything the council did. Back on Earth, things had been moving in ways the council did not seem to notice or care about. Yuna had been appointed head of the Interstellar Science Division 3 years ago. She was not a loud person. She did not give speeches or make announcements about the importance of her work. She simply worked, and the people around her worked, and what they produced was extraordinary. Her teams had developed a new class of biological treatment that could adapt to foreign pathogen structures. A breakthrough born out of necessity, because human medical personnel had been repeatedly sent into environments that no other species wanted to enter. The council had filed the research under auxiliary contribution. Yuna had noted that too in her own way and kept working. On 2 the Lenny colony worlds, a respiratory illness had been spreading for 18 months. The Lenny had good doctors. They were, in fact, considered one of the more medically advanced species in the council. But the pathogen was behaving in ways their models had not predicted, and it was spreading across biological barriers that should have stopped it. They had asked 3 other species for help. All 3 had sent assessments. All 3 had concluded that the risk of cross-contamination for their own personnel was too high. The human medical teams had been there within 6 weeks of the first request. Not because anyone had formally asked humanity. Observer species were not formally asked for things they were permitted to offer. Juno had offered. The teams had gone. For 14 months they had worked in those colonies, running treatment programs and building containment protocols and training local health workers in methods that could be maintained after the humans left. The illness had not been eliminated, but it had been pushed back far enough that the Valeni population was no longer in crisis. The Council had issued a brief statement acknowledging the auxiliary medical support provided. It had not named the human teams. It had not named Yuna's division. It had not suggested that any formal recognition was appropriate. Jisoo had read the statement at her desk and said nothing for a long time. The Cradle of Voices station itself had a problem that nobody was discussing openly. It was old, 400 years of continuous habitation and expansion had left its original structural framework carrying loads it had not been designed for. A Velhari engineering commission had reviewed the station 20 years ago and concluded that the decay rate was within acceptable limits. The commission had been made up entirely of Velhari engineers using Velhari modeling software. Nobody had asked for a second opinion. Juno had asked Yuna's division to take a quiet look at the publicly available station schematics. Her lead structural engineer, a quiet man named Day One before he became Secretary General, no, that was someone else, a different Day One, had run the numbers twice and come to the same conclusion both times. The station's load-bearing framework on its middle residential ring was deteriorating faster than the Velhari model showed. The Velhari model had an error in it. A small error, but structural errors had a way of becoming large over time. Juno had submitted the findings as an observer technical note. The Council's Infrastructure Committee had thanked him and filed it. He had kept a copy. There were 3 trade disputes running between smaller member species that had been quietly paralyzing 2 of the Council's main shipping corridors for almost 2 years. The disputes were not complicated in their origins, resource boundary disagreements, the kind of thing that got resolved through negotiation rather than force. The problem was that the species involved did not trust each other's mediators, and the Council's official mediation office was staffed primarily by Velhari personnel, which 2 of the 3 disputing parties refused to accept. Jisoo had started meeting informally with the junior aides from both sides 8 months ago. Not as a mediator, observer species could not formally mediate, just as someone willing to sit in a room and listen to both of them talk. It had started as conversation. Slowly, carefully, it had become something more structured. Progress was being made. Nobody on the Council had officially noticed. Nobody ever officially noticed. It was on a quiet afternoon in the 3rd corridor of the lower residential block. Still no windows, that Ambassador Relk found Juno walking alone. Relk was Borati, a squat species with broad shoulders and very small, very careful eyes. He was not a senior figure in the Council, but he had been around long enough to know how things worked and honest enough to be uncomfortable with it. He fell into step beside Juno without greeting him. They walked in silence for a moment. "There is a vote coming," Relk said quietly. "Not scheduled yet, but it has been agreed upon in the closed rooms. A formal classification, permanent observer status. A defined category with a defined ceiling." He paused. "No path forward. No membership. The language will sound administrative. It will not be." Juno kept walking. His face did not change. "When?" he asked. "Soon," Relk said. "I am sorry. I thought you should know." They reached a junction in the corridor. Relk turned left without another word. Juno stood at the junction for a moment, looking at the gray wall ahead of him. Then he turned and walked back to his quarters. He sat at his desk. He was quiet for a while. Then he opened a secure channel to Earth and composed a message to Secretary General Day One. It was 4 words. "Begin drafting the letter." He sent it and closed the channel and sat in the silence of a room with no windows, in a station that was slowly falling apart, in a council that had spent 6 years making a very careful and very serious mistake. Outside, the stars were there. He just couldn't see them from here. That was all right. He knew where they were. The grand session happened once every standard year. Every member species sent its full delegation. Every counselor sat in their assigned seat. The chamber was full in a way it was not during ordinary sessions. Louder before it began, heavier with the kind of importance that large rooms collect when enough powerful people gather in them at the same time. Juno arrived early. He and Jisoo took their seats on the observer platform without speaking. Jisoo had a data pad in front of her and a pen she was not using. Juno had nothing on the desk in front of him except his hands, folded together, still. He had read the letter 3 times the night before. It had taken Daewon's office 2 weeks to draft it, and in that time it had gone through 11 versions. The final version was short. It was precise. Every word in it had been chosen carefully, not to wound, not to threaten, but to say exactly what it meant and nothing more. Juno had approved it without changes. It was a good letter. It said what needed to be said in the clearest possible way, and it did not apologize for saying it. The chamber filled slowly. The Velhari delegation came in as a group, robes pressed, movements unhurried. Counselor Vreth took his seat at the center of the main table and spoke briefly to the aide beside him without looking up. He had the comfortable manner of a person who had never once walked into a room and wondered whether he belonged there. Counselor Asa of the Veleni arrived next. She was tall and thin, with 6 silver eyes that moved independently of one another, scanning the room in small, rapid arcs. She glanced at the human platform as she passed it. Her eyes held for a moment, 1 second, maybe 2, and then she moved on to her seat. Counselor Yin of the Sulai came in quietly and sat at the far left of the main table. Yin was old, by Sulai standards, with pale coloring and slow, deliberate movements. She had been on the council for 12 years. In that time, Juno had watched her speak exactly 4 times in open session. She was not someone who spoke often, but the 4 times she had spoken, the room had gone very still and listened. The session was called to order. The clerk read the agenda. The Permanent Observer Classification Act was listed as the 3rd item. It had been written to sound like paperwork. Most harmful things were written to sound like paperwork. The first 2 items moved quickly. A trade route extension. A joint research protocol between 2 member species. Both passed without discussion. Then the clerk announced the 3rd item. Before the counselor chairing the session could open the floor, Juno stood up. There was a procedural rule, small, obscure, buried in the original council charter, that allowed any party present in the chamber, including observers, to request a brief procedural moment before a session item was formally opened. The moment could last no longer than 90 seconds. It had been designed 400 years ago for minor housekeeping matters. It had almost never been used for anything else. Juno used it now. The chair gave him a short, mildly irritated nod. 90 seconds. The room did not go quiet immediately. A few conversations continued at the edges. A few aides kept typing. But something in the way Juno stood, something in the quality of his stillness, caused the noise to drop away before he even opened his mouth. He did not look at Vreth. He looked at the room. On behalf of the human species and the government of Earth, he said, I am submitting a formal notice of withdrawal from the Galactic Concord, effective in 30 standard days from this session. The grounds for withdrawal are irreconcilable disparity between contribution and recognition, and the demonstrated unwillingness of this body to negotiate membership terms in good faith over a period of 6 years. He reached into the folder in front of him, took out a single printed document, and placed it on the observer's podium. The notice is submitted in accordance with Article 7 of the original Council Charter, which permits any recognized body, including observer species, to formally withdraw with 30 days' notice. A copy has already been transmitted to the Council's official records office. He paused for exactly 1 second. Thank you for your time. He sat down. The chamber was completely silent. It lasted several seconds, long enough to feel strange, long enough for people to look at each other and find that no one had an expression ready for this moment. Then Vreth laughed. It was a short sound, not quite amused, more like the noise a person makes when they want the room to know they are not concerned. He leaned toward his microphone. Observer species do not have the legal standing to. Article 7 does not distinguish between member and observer standing, Juno said, without standing up, without raising his voice. The language covers any recognized body in formal relationship with the Council. We qualify. The withdrawal is valid. Vretha's mouth closed. Counselor Asa's 6 eyes were all pointing in the same direction now, which was unusual. They were all pointing at Juno. The rapid arcing had stopped. She was very still. Counselor Yin, at the far end of the table, folded her hands in front of her and looked down at the surface of the desk. Her expression was unreadable, but she did not look surprised. Jisoo stood up when Juno did. She did not look back at the chamber as they walked toward the exit. She had learned that from him. The exit was the direction you were going, and you went there without checking whether anyone was watching. Of course they were watching. That was not the point. The point was that you kept walking. Back in the human quarters, Juno sent 2 messages. The first was to Admiral Miho, commander of the human fleet escort currently running protective patrols on 3 council shipping corridors. The message told him to begin a gradual, orderly recall of all vessels. No urgency. No announcement. Just a slow, professional withdrawal. The second message was to Yuna. It told her to begin packing the equipment from the 2 joint research stations where human science teams were currently working. Carefully. Thoroughly. Leave nothing behind that belonged to them. Both messages were short. Both were acknowledged within the hour. In the council chamber, the grand session had dissolved into something that was not quite an argument and not quite a panic but had elements of both. The Permanent Observer Classification Act had not been voted on. Nobody had moved to bring it back to the floor. Somewhere in the noise, a clerk was trying to figure out whether the human withdrawal document needed to be formally entered into the record, or whether there was a procedure for rejecting it. There was no procedure for rejecting it. Juno had checked. 30 days. That was all the time left. Not a threat. Not a negotiating position. Just a fact, clean and simple, sitting on the observer's podium in a printed document that nobody in that room had been prepared to see. Outside the cradle of voices, in the deep quiet of open space, the first human escort vessel turned and began the long journey home. The first 4 days were quiet. That was the part nobody had expected. Vretha's faction had predicted noise, angry transmissions from Earth, requests to negotiate, maybe a formal appeal asking for the withdrawal to be paused. There were people on the council who had quietly prepared responses to all of those things. They had their language ready, their positions organized, their concessions calculated to sound generous while giving away as little as possible. None of it was needed. Earth sent nothing. Juno sent nothing. The human delegation had vacated their quarters on the station by the morning after the grand session. The observer platform in the chamber sat empty. The narrow desk, the 2 chairs, the translation feed. All of it still there, exactly as it had been, but with no one in it. It looked like a room where something had recently left. On the 4th day, the 3 trade disputes that Jisoo had been quietly managing collapsed. It happened fast once it started. Without her informal sessions, the junior aides from both sides had no place to bring their concerns that felt safe enough to be honest in. They went back to their senior delegations. Their senior delegations went back to their official positions. Their official positions were incompatible, and both sides knew it, and knowing it made them angrier than they had been before the informal sessions started. By the end of the 4th day, 1 species had revoked shipping access through their corridor entirely. 2 supply chains that served outer colony worlds went dark. The Council's official mediation office was contacted. It began its formal procedures. Formal procedures took, on average, 4 to 7 months to produce a first draft response. The outer colonies would need supplies before then. On the 9th day, the news came from the Lenny colony worlds. The illness had not been gone. It had been pushed back, controlled, held at a line that the human medical teams had drawn and maintained. When the teams left, they had trained local health workers as carefully as time allowed. But the pathogen was adaptive, and it had spent 14 months learning the shape of the containment around it. Within days of the human team's departure, it had found a gap. A small gap. A technical detail in a treatment protocol that required a piece of equipment the local workers did not have and did not know how to replace. The illness came back. Faster this time. The Lenny sent requests to 4 species with medical capability. All 4 reviewed the case files. All 4 came back with the same answer: the biological complexity was too high, the cross-contamination risk for their own personnel was not acceptable. 1 offered to send diagnostic equipment and written guidance. It was a genuine offer, made in good faith. It was also not enough. Counselor Asa sat in her office on the 9th night and read the reports from the colony worlds. She read them twice. Then she opened a file that her staff had been quietly compiling for the past 3 days. A document that had started as a personal exercise and had grown into something she had not expected. It listed every human contribution to council operations over the past 6 years that had been formally classified as auxiliary. It was long. It was specific. It had dates, names, project codes, and outcome assessments. Reading it straight through took almost 2 hours. Asa read all of it. When she finished, she closed the file and sat in silence for a while. On the 14th day, she brought the document to a closed session, a small meeting of senior counselors, no aides, no public record. She placed printed copies in front of everyone at the table and asked them to read before she spoke. Nobody argued with her. There was something in the way she set the papers down that made argument feel inappropriate. The room was quiet for a long time after everyone finished reading. Then one of the Borati counselors said, carefully, that he had not realized the station reinforcement work had been done by human engineers. He had been told it was a routine infrastructure update. Nobody had mentioned who designed it. Asa told them what Juno's structural report had said. The one filed as an observer technical note 2 years ago. The one that had been thanked for and filed. She told them what the report had actually found. On the 19th day, the council's own infrastructure team was sent to re-examine the middle residential ring of the Cradle of Voices. They used their own equipment and their own models. They found the same error in the Velhari model that Yuna's engineer had found 2 years ago. Without the human reinforcement work, without regular maintenance on the specific load points the human design had identified, the station had an estimated safe structural lifespan of 11 years. 11 years was not a long time for a station that was supposed to last forever. Vreth gave a speech on the 22nd day. It was delivered in open session, and it was a confident speech, the kind he was good at. He argued that humanity was bluffing. He said that no species with genuine interstellar capability would walk away from a seat at the most important governing body in the known galaxy over a matter of classification. He said that the 30-day clock was a negotiating tactic, nothing more, and that the correct response was patience. He was halfway through his third point when Counselor Yin stood up. Yin did not speak often. The room remembered that. It went quiet in the particular way it went quiet when she rose, not out of respect for her position, but out of the instinctive recognition that something real was about to be said. She looked at Vreth for a moment without speaking. Then she said, in a voice that was slow and even and carried to every corner of the chamber, that he was a fool. She did not say it with anger. She said it the way a person states a measurement. Here is the distance, here is the weight, here is the fact. She said that he had spent a decade looking at patience and calling it weakness, looking at restraint and calling it submission, and that he had made every decision based on the assumption that the humans would always stay because they had nowhere better to go. She said that assumption had been wrong from the beginning and that the last 6 years of evidence had made it impossible to continue holding. She sat back down. Vreth did not finish his speech. On the 25th day, 2 more things happened. The Sulai delegation quietly submitted a request for an emergency review of the Permanent Observer Classification Act, asking that the vote be suspended indefinitely pending a broader charter review. And the Borati ambassador, Relk, sent a private message to an address on Earth that he had kept in his files for 6 years. It was not an official communication. It was a personal one. It said only that he hoped the 30 days had not run out on more than just a deadline. On the 28th day, an emergency diplomatic shuttle was authorized and dispatched from the Cradle of Voices toward Earth. Juno was already there when it left. He had gone home on the 2nd day. He was sitting in an office in Seoul, drinking coffee, reading reports, doing the same work he had always done. The work did not change just because the location had. He had meetings with Day One every morning. He had calls with Yuna in the afternoons. He went home in the evenings to a small apartment with large windows, and he stood at those windows sometimes in the quiet of the night and looked at the sky. It was the same sky. The stars were the same stars. On the 29th day, Counselor Vreth resigned his seat on the Galactic Concord Council, citing personal reasons. The announcement was brief and contained no further explanation. The shuttle was still 2 days from Earth when it happened. Nobody on board said much after the news came through. They sat with it quietly, each of them doing their own private accounting of the last 30 days, adding up what had been lost and what it had cost and what it might take to get any of it back. Outside the shuttle's windows, the stars moved slowly past. They did not care about councils or classifications or 30-day clocks. They had been burning long before any of this began, and they would go on burning long after. The shuttle flew on toward the pale blue point of light that was Earth. 2 days left on the clock. Thinking, the shuttle landed on a clear morning. Seoul was cold that time of year, with a pale sky and a sharp wind that moved through the streets in long, steady gusts. The city was busy the way it was always busy, full of people going places, full of noise and movement and the ordinary energy of a world that had not stopped turning because of anything happening far above it. The shuttle came down at a private landing pad on the edge of the government district, and the delegation that stepped out of it walked into a waiting car without ceremony and was driven to a building that had no special markings on the outside. Counselor Yin led the delegation. She had 4 others with her, 2 from the Theleni, 1 Borati, 1 from a smaller species called the Veth who had joined quietly and said almost nothing during the journey. They were all experienced people. They had all been in difficult rooms before. None of them had been in a room quite like this one. Vreth was not with them. His seat was empty. No one mentioned him. The conference room where Day 1 received them was plain. A long table, chairs on both sides, water on a small side table, windows looking out at the gray city sky. No decorations. No symbols of Earth's space program on the walls. No flags. No display screens showing humanity's achievements. Just a room. Day 1 had chosen it specifically because it was just a room. He wanted no performance. He wanted nothing that could be read as showing off. Day 1 was a large, quiet man in his late 50s with short gray hair and the kind of face that did not give much away. He had been Secretary General for 4 years. Before that, he had been a colonial logistics administrator, the person responsible for keeping distant human settlements supplied and functioning. He was used to solving problems that other people had given up on. He was also used to the specific exhaustion of doing necessary work that no one above him wanted to formally acknowledge. He stood when the delegation entered. He shook hands with each of them, the human gesture, offered without explanation, accepted without confusion. Then everyone sat down. Juno was beside Day 1. Jisoo sat 2 seats further down with a pad in front of her, pen in hand. On the other side of the table, Yin folded her hands and looked at Day 1 steadily with her pale, calm eyes. There was a moment of silence. Not uncomfortable, just a pause, the kind that happens when something important is about to begin and everyone in the room knows it. Then Yin spoke. She did not offer a proposal. She did not open with a negotiating position or a list of what the council was prepared to give. She took a single folded document from the case beside her, opened it, and began to read. It was a formal admission of institutional error, recorded in the Galactic Concord Council's official archive, authorized by a full vote of the remaining 16 member species. It had passed without a single dissenting vote. The Sulai had written the first draft. The Theleni had added the medical section. The Borati had added the language about the structural reports. Every item on Asa's list had been reviewed, confirmed, and entered into the record. Yin read the whole thing out loud. Took 11 minutes. She named the V7 Outer Reach Survey. She named the 14 months of medical work on the Theleni colony worlds. She named Yuna's division by name not as auxiliary support, but as the specific team responsible for specific outcomes. She named the structural engineering work on the Cradle of Voices. She named the trade dispute mediation. She named the 6 years of delayed membership votes and the procedural methods used to delay them. She named every entry on the list, one by one, in the flat and unhurried voice of a person reading facts into a permanent record. When she finished, she folded the document and placed it on the table. Day 1 had not moved during the reading. His hands were flat on the table in front of him, and his face had not changed. When Yin placed the document down, he let the silence sit for a moment. Then he looked at Juno. Juno gave the smallest nod. One movement barely visible. Said, Asterisk yes. This is what we came for. Go ahead. Asterisk. Day One looked back at Yin. We accept the record, he said. And we have terms for return. He slid a document across the table. It was not long. It had been written by Juno over 3 quiet evenings in his apartment, revised once by Day One, and not revised again. Said what it meant. Full voting membership, effective on the date of return. No observer period, no review phase, no assessment window. Membership, retroactive formal credit for the V7 Outer Reach survey, entered into the official resource charter with humanity listed as the originating survey body. A new clause in the council charter making it illegal to hold any recognized species in observer status for more than 3 standard years without a binding membership vote. And one final item. Human personnel would no longer accept assignment to any task classified as auxiliary. If a task was critical to council operations, it would be named as critical in the official record before human teams were deployed to it. Not after. Before. Yin read the terms without expression. The others at her side read along with her. When they finished, she looked up. These are acceptable, she said. No counteroffer. No request for modifications. The council had come to Earth because it had run out of room to negotiate from. Yin knew it. Day One knew it. Everyone at the table knew it. There was something almost restful about a moment when everyone in a room is finally being honest at the same time. The documents were signed. Copies were made. Hands were shaken again across the table, and this time the gesture felt different. Not a courtesy, but something closer to an acknowledgement. A small, physical admission that the people on the other side of the table were worth the gesture. The delegation left in the early afternoon. The car took them back to the landing pad, and the shuttle lifted into the pale sky and was gone. In the conference room, Jisoo closed her pad and sat back in her chair. Day One was already on a call with someone in his office. Juno was still at the table, looking at nothing in particular, the quiet expression on his face that she had learned, over 7 years, meant he was finished with something. She had carried a question for a long time. She had never asked it because there had always been something more pressing, some next thing to prepare for, some next moment to be ready for. Now there was no next moment. There was just the room and the pale light through the windows and the sound of the city outside. Did you always know it would work out? She asked. Juno was quiet. The kind of quiet that meant he was actually thinking about it, not buying time. No, he said. But I knew we could afford to find out. Jisoo looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once and stood up and began gathering her things. 3 days later, Yuna's science teams re-entered the joint research station at the edge of the Vithium corridor. They came in through the main airlock in their suits, moving carefully through the cold and the dark of a station that had been sitting empty and powered down for 32 days. The lead technician found the main power panel, ran the startup sequence, and waited. The lights came on, one section at a time, then the next, a slow warm brightening moving through the corridors of the station like something waking up. Equipment hummed back to life. Climate systems began cycling. Screens lit up with data feeds that had been paused mid-reading a month ago and were now simply continuing, as if nothing had interrupted them. Yuna's team took off their helmets. Someone put a coffee on. Someone else pulled up the research files and found their place in them and started reading. Work resumed. Outside the station's wide observation windows, the stars were the same stars they had always been. Steady, indifferent, permanent. They had been there before the council. They would be there long after. They did not know or care about formal admissions of error or charter amendments or documents signed in a plain room in Seoul on a cold morning. But the people inside the station knew. And that, in the end, was enough.